أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
Hello, Dr. Gonzales. It's a real pleasure to have you here as part of the Beauty and Islamic Theology project. And if I may begin with a question, so your work is really rich and multifaceted, but one of the things that really undergirds your research is an investigation into beauty and Islamic aesthetics. So I wanted to begin by asking what initially drew you to the study of beauty and aesthetics in Islamic art and architecture?
Yes. So, first of all, what drove me to invest in the topic of beauty and to invest my research and thinking about the beauty, the topic of beauty in my research is the beauty of Islamic art itself. Definitely, when the experience of Islamic art makes you feel the sense of beauty is very much at stake, and not the beauty, intellectual beauty primarily, but literally the optical beauty of Islamic art. And that's something that is fascinating because you have this experience which is very much based on the senses, before knowing, before just thinking about what you are experiencing. You experience something which is very riveting perceptually. So there is this sense of perceptual beauty, of great beauty, phenomenological beauty. Like the senses are taken, are the first target of this visuality in Islamic art. So that's something that I felt always, and I thought there is something here to investigate, something very important at stake. The concept of beauty is an important concept that is working in this aesthetic environment, which is unique to Islamic art. It is unique to Islamic art because you can say that everything is beautiful. You enter a Buddhist temple, it's beautiful, and so on. But you have figurative representation that immediately appeal to the viewer as something discursive. Something is told to you, or you recognize a figure. You say, "Oh, this figure looks like me." I mean, it looks realistic, or it looks ethereal. So you have an encounter that is based on different features that immediately uh, discourse with the aesthetic experience itself in many cultural contexts. So something is told, something has to do with me as a body, me as a face, and so on. You don't have that when you encounter, as as a first encounter, when you look at Islamic art.
Mm.
What you see, you feel an extraordinary beauty, but without being involved in a discourse. But you sense that discourse is there because of calligraphy. But the
Mhm.
discourse, you don't know it because before you read, which is another step. But what I'm talking about here is the first experience when you enter a building or you hold an object. So it's just this beauty of things. But the emphasis of perceptual beauty that is unique. And the vehicle for this to work is ornament. So the importance of Islamic ornament as the producer of beauty. And ornament is everywhere in Islamic art, on objects, in architecture, on books, even on Qurans, so everywhere. So yes, so that's the what drove me, this observation, my experience of Islamic art, but even prior to being an academic. I And then it's my own biography because I was born in Algeria.
Mm.
Yes, from family of Spanish immigrant, and most of my family comes from the south of Spain. So it's my culture as well.
Let's see.
Because
Wow, fascinating.
yeah, you know, you can see that my name is Spanish is because of that. So I was born, you know, from I come from family of immigrants, and so for me it was, and I was born during the war of independence of the Algerians from the French. And so it was a painful history that also I had to sort out for me,
Mm,
because we were Europeans, but we were not colonialists. We were basically in the same situation as the Algerians themselves. I'm talking about the Berbers and the Arabs. We were in a situation that was very ambiguous and very difficult. So I had to sort all of this out, and this drove me to go back to my origins in Spain and the Islamic history and culture of Spain that
mm.
is mine.
Well, that sounds like a fascinating journey, which began with this kind of phenomenological experience of Islamic art, and then it culminated in a more of a, let's say, academic or theoretical approach in order to understand the kind of material and visual culture you were facing. And on that note, it's clear in your from reading your work that you've really mined through the treasury of writers on Islamic aesthetics. And I wanted to know, is there, you know, some conception of beauty in the Islamic philosophical or theological or cultural tradition that has really stood out for you or fascinated you?
Yes, so not only you know, in empirically you can see that the concept of beauty is everywhere empirically and in Islamic art as a visual environment, as an aesthetic environment, but also then when I started to study, um, um, studying Islamic art implying studying Islamic philosophy, Islamic theology, Islamic law in a very superficial way. You know, Islamic law is a specialty, but you have to look at it. You have to know that there are schools of law. All the mechanism of the intellectual life in Islam is obviously something that we need to investigate, even though it's not the primary object, scientific object or object of observation. And then when I read this material, and first of all the Quran itself, then it became clear that the concept of beauty is an expansive concept that is thought in Islam in different ways, in an expansive ways, and it basically there is beauty in every field, intellectual field in Islam. Beauty is present, at stake, thought of, and produces a sort of theory. So you have beauty, first of all, the beauty of God, the divine beauty is there with the 99 beautiful. This is elementary. This is the first thing, you know, the beauty of the names of God, meaning beauty is a divine paradigm. That's already, you know, a big thing. And it's the source of all these thoughts about beauty in Islam. The beauty of God itself, then the beauty of its creation, which is developed that you can sense, and it's explained sometimes with in the Quran, for example, with this idea of the that everything is well measured, so harmonious, well built, with these descriptions of both the phenomenal world and the metaphysical world, the world beyond the seen. So in the Quran, you have these descriptions, these explanations about the world, and in these explanations, the notion of beauty is always present. And there are a few concepts, like the concept of measure. And then there are descriptions of objects, like in Surah Al-Mulk, where you have the description of the seven heaven. It's a perfect construction, and God asks the faithful to look at this construction with the seven heaven, one upon the other, and summon the faithful to find any flaw. So the idea of a perfect order, something harmonious, something flawless, and that's related, that is definitely related with the notion of beauty. So the beauty of creation, and then in the human life, the beauty of the beauty as a concept associated with goodness, with good deeds, with being faithful, with being on the right path, and this is beautiful. So the association between beauty and ethics, and then the scientific beauty. So it's also not only an object of thought, of ethical thought, of philosophical, theological thought related to the beauty of God, the beauty of Prophet Muhammad as well, but also beauty is an object, a scientific object of study. With, of course, the major, but he's not the only one, Ibn al-Haytham, with his Kitab al-Manazir. It's extraordinary because he's trying to develop a theory of beauty which is scientific and phenomenological. Scientifics based on optics, really the science of seeing, organically seeing something, but also the phenomenology of beauty, how beauty is an object that exists in the living world and is perceived by consciousness according to a certain number of criteria, proportions, harmony, and so on. All his concepts creates in his Kitab al-Manazir help us to understand that beauty is something well constructed, something symmetric, harmonious, and based on proportions. So, of course, here we have the ancient Greek background. We understand where all this is coming from. But now, in the Islamic context, with beauty everywhere, associated with ethics, with theology, with sciences, and then in the material world, in the arts, you get more and more a sense that beauty is a foundation of Islamic culture. And it is related to God as a source of beauty, God as the paradigm of beauty, and Muhammad as well for human beings. So it's physical. There is this. Then to close this discussion about beauty as a concept in Islam, obviously the inner beauty and the outer beauty, and both are important. Because in Islam, God tells you that the world is beautiful. You have to appreciate the world because it is beautiful, because it is my creation, and because it is my ayah. And beauty is ayah. And everything in Islam is about ayah, a sign, because you don't know how God looks like. It doesn't look like anything. It's an abstract concept, unfathomable concept. God is knowable only through his ayat. And beauty is an ayah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzales. You spoke about so many different contexts for beauty there. You spoke about revelation, prophecy, theological texts, philosophical texts, scientific texts. And I guess the next question, the logical question is, to what extent do you think these kinds of concepts translated into material culture, whether in terms of the conception of material culture or the reception? And if so, what are some of the frameworks or methodologies that we can use to better understand the relationship between these kinds of texts and then the emergence of material culture, which may or may not have reflected some of these ideas?
Oh yes, I think that by understanding the system of aesthetic values, we understand how it's a way to understand the material culture, and what I call the aesthetic materialities, really the artworks themselves. We can see the values are translated. The aesthetic values in philosophy, in theology, in science are translated in the material world through the aesthetic materialities. And one concrete concept that we can grasp, which is associated with ethical beauty, theological beauty, the beauty of God, and so on and so forth, is geometry and mathematics. And this notion of measure that is in the Quran, and then that is associated, measurement associated with geometry, with mathematics, again, scientific practice or scientific practices. So geometry is a mathematical concept which is applicable and which becomes a tool to make things. So this notion of beauty, which is theological, philosophical, and ethical, is translated in the Islamic materialities through the application of geometry and mathematics. And in order to produce materialities that are perfectly ordered as much as possible, obviously, and math embodies the concept of perfection and order. And this is again something which is we can concretely read in Bel Khaldun or Ikhwan al-Safa, how geometry is and mathematics is the way to construct things in the most perfect way. And this is the way to translate, to be a Muslim is being a producer of beauty with human means, and the humans means are making things that are beautiful, and how to make these things which are beautiful with a sense of order. And this is the values, this is the path chosen, which is to construct things that are harmonious, beautiful, symmetric, mathematically ordered, and we can definitely see that in the materialities. And again, it's everywhere, on objects and architecture. And this notion of, and all this is, the thread is again ornament, because ornament is this kind of material flow that embraces all artistic media. And Islamic ornament is geometrically conceptualized, whether the motif are calligraphy, vegetal motif, even iconography. This order is material order is ornamental, is an ornamental order. And this ornamental order is constructed upon mathematics. Mathematical criteria, order, symmetry, geometrical organization, and the principle of harmony and proportions.
I mean, that the idea of the geometry one is one which really resonates, I think, with many in terms of just an experience of Islamic art that non-specialists have. And I wanted to ask, even though it's very clear that, these ideas, as you expressed in Ibn al-Haytham and Ikhwan al-Safa, and Ibn Khaldun, it's very difficult to find similar statements made by the artists and architects that were responsible for the construction of these buildings and the production of works. So even though it's very clear that there is this kind of link here, from the perspective of an art historian, it's very difficult to argue that unless we speak about aesthetic sensibility. And I just wanted to know in your opinion, and from a historical perspective, why is it that artists are not producing texts where they're reflexive about their own experiences in producing work? Is it just, this is not what artists did in the Islamic period, or is there like another reason?
No, it's just that they are part of they have a certain status, and they are not necessarily those who are writing things. And probably the oral tradition was very much alive, but it's not then written down for us scholars to have available. And in a global perspective, you have to understand that very little cultures produce aesthetic texts that explain the art. And basically you have the West and China, and a tiny bit in India, but very little. It's more like a system and value, but texts that really help to explain the art in details, aesthetic texts, aesthetic treatises that really explain, help the scholar to go, in details about how aesthetic materialities are conceptualized and made. This doesn't exist in most global cultures. So you have how artists are working or through the oral traditions, through practices, through social organizations, and through pragmatics, but not necessarily by written down the norms. Um, so once you have this in mind, there is nothing surprising that we don't have the equivalent of Alberti, for example, in the Islamic world, or the equivalent of this extraordinary Chinese, ancient Chinese aesthetic text that help to explain how Chinese paint, how they produce landscape painting and so on and so forth. So you can say, scholars of these these materials are lucky because they have the text to help them to understand. We don't have that, but that's our work yeah. Then it makes things very difficult to verify, and you need then the reasoning, and the reasoning replaces the exact evidence that you can find in text, or not find in text. I mean, the reasoning is the key here.
I think one of the things you do so well to kind of to deal with that challenge is you use multiple theoretical perspectives in order to multiply the lens through which we can understand material culture. And just to kind of zoom in on your book, Beauty and Islam, one of the things you do in that book is that you propose a really riveting and fascinating aesthetic interpretation of the palace or the Hall of the Comares in Alhambra. And I just want to, maybe I can share an image of the, just so people are aware of the thing we're talking about. This is actually from your book.
Yeah.
And this is the ceiling of the hall, and it also has some Quranic inscriptions, as you mentioned earlier. One of these is الَّذِي خَلَقَ سَبْعَ سَمَاوَاتٍ طِبَاقًا, which is that God created the seven heavens one on top of the other. And so some scholars have argued for a direct kind of symbolic interpretation of this verse. But in your book, you really plunge into the depths of the rich and complex relationship between these particular verses and visual media and architecture. So I wanted to ask if you could kind of summarize your own interpretation, which has more of a phenomenological analysis, and then explain perhaps what led you to this particular approach.
Yes. First of all, when the way I proceed is that I look at things intensively before before engaging in any discussions or even in any investigation. I look at the objects. And it takes a lot of time for me because I need to leave this object for a long time before I start to discuss them. Many times before I studied it, and I always thought, oh, it's like something that is taking you, but without telling you this is this and this is that. That was my experience of the place, and also my intuition, intellectual intuition, is that there is an avoidance of representation in this art. Now, how do you explain that? Because here we have a configuration in the Comares Hall in which we have at the basis of this dome the inscription of Surat al-Mulk that describes the seventh heaven in very vivid terms. However, when you think about the image of the seventh heaven, I mean, it's far from looking like this. What is important here is that we have a phenomenologic sense of an object which is above us, located physically above us, above our head, as us human being. So it's an object which is oriented towards the sky versus, for example, the floor on which we put our feet, and we have a completely different experience. We have an earthly experience of things. And this is very well explained in phenomenology, in particular a book which is a French that I read in French, but it's translated into multiple language, is The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. And recently I have a Chinese student, and she's reading it in Chinese. So it's translated into Chinese because she's working on domes. That's her thesis, how to look at domes in Islamic art and different configurations. And then this term, configuration, I found it's a key concept, because when you look at the design itself, the design is not particularly associated with a description of something. It's more like the configuration of the design with the dome that produces an evocation of the celestial vault, or something that looks like a starry sky. But the design itself, it appears on different media, starry patterns on a door, starry patterns on a piece of wall which is not a dome, which doesn't evoke the sky or doesn't evoke the celestial vault or the heavens, the seven heavens or anything, but it's the same design. So the same design is this design is a flow, again, that can be adapted to different locations and be differently configured. And that the key is that according to the configuration of this geometry, because we are dealing with geometrical designs which do not represent anything, because when they are on a door or on an object, also they appear like that, the starry design on an object, a casket. There is a casket of the Nasrid period, and you have a starry design on the lid. So the lid doesn't represent, or even on the body of the object, you have this. So it's a flow. It's something that may be transformed and produce a different experience depending where this design, on which artistic medium this design is appearing. And so it's about configuring things with these ornaments, and these configurations then localized precisely in a room, in architecture, or on an object, produces some form of imagery. But it's the configuration, and so we are dealing with an evocation and what I call the imaging power of geometry. But it depends on how it is configured and the function of the building. And here the Surah al-Mulk is primarily there, inscribed in this room, because it's the room where the ruler would conduct political events. And Surah al-Mulk is about kingdom, it's about Islamic politics. It's about who is the ruler in this world, and it's God, and so on and so forth. So it's there because of the function of the room, as the throne room or the hall of the ambassador, the Comares. It's in the palace. It was the political headquarters of the Nasrids. So the Surah al-Mulk there has a discursive function to specify the political conception in Islam, which is divine kingship. And everywhere in the Alhambra you have this slogan, La Ghaliba illallah, which is a political slogan. Everything is about God. God is the only one who can be victorious. He's the only king. That's what the surah is telling. And then you have the eschatological aspect of the surah, which is very strong, of course, the earth, the heaven, everything about Islam, how the world, the metaphysics of Islam is there. Now, the association of the dome with these inscriptions, now it's working as a materiality where you can, the artists, the patrons, and the user of the room, the visitors, could associate the seven heaven with the configuration of the dome, with the position of the dome above the head, which is obviously, in terms of direction, in terms of physical phenomenology, directed towards the heavens, the unseen. But the representation of the seven domes, it is the seven heavens, it is not. There is no representation. It's about configuring, evocation, geometric design, ornament, and all these concepts are manipulated in order to form a system that is producing an evocation of the heavens, possibly among many other things. The starry, you can think about the planets and the stars as the lamp with the divine light, the association between the stars and the divine light, and are sort of like little lamps in the sky. You can produce all sort of analogies and metaphors. It's what is called another concept, which is theorized by Umberto Eco, is the concept of the open work. And that's exactly what is happening here. It's an open work. It's not, the representation is not working on participation and open work. It's working in a very different way. And we do not have this system in Islamic art in general. Unless we are dealing with the art of the book, illustrating book with paintings in books, then we have full-fledged figurative representation working as representations, but not in architecture, actually. Very little. And I consider even that figurative representation in architecture works are part of the ornament. I don't consider, but that's an intuition, that's something I need to articulate a little more. But my intuition, and that in architecture, this figurative representation, we know that they existed. We know there are some in the Alhambra, but when you look at those in the Alhambra that were made by Christian artists invited by the Nasrid, you can, and they are inserted into this aesthetics of the Alhambra, this geometric aesthetic, ornamental aesthetics, and you can see that the paintings are just inserted there, but their discursive power is tremendously diminished, because representation is not the major function of these aesthetic materialities. And it's not about a hierarchy here. It's about what interests the Muslim beholder.
I think that it's really, interesting, because it speaks of a kind of ever-shifting and dynamic relationship between art, theology, politics, not only in terms of the kind of shifting context for the art, but also in terms of the fact that these meanings change based on the beholder, right? And I think that's a really fascinating idea, because it means that these works are polyvalent, right? Which is something that we miss perhaps when we seek to really bind meaning to a particular form and say, okay, because it has this inscription and it looks like this, we're going to put one and one together, and therefore this is the meaning, regardless of the kind of beholder or the context. And I think that your work really goes into that with such interesting detail and insight. I think another question for you, I know we just spoke about the Comares Hall, but is there, I guess one of the primary audiences for these conversations is people that are engaged in Islamic theology. And so is there any kind of as a final question, is there any kind of spaces or buildings that you would recommend people to go in if they want to kind of engage in a similar kind of experience?
Oh, you mean another building than
the Hall of the Comares? Is there any place that you've been to where you found a kind of really fascinating relationship between theology and art?
Yeah, I think these systems it's a system. an aesthetic system that is working from the Umayyad period to today, to the contemporary era, and from Spain to India. I mean, it's something that is always there. It's the what I would call, I mean, the essence, the principles of Islamic art. And this is very, currently there is a sort of ideology about how to make it, how to literally to make the history of Islamic art, is that to talk about principle, essences, and concepts is essentializing. Like you simplify things. So going to the bottom of things, meaning essentializing, no. I mean, this is and that's why we end up with an art history that is actually very superficial or is confined to factuality, social context, history, archaeology, but that it's an art history that do not provide explanations about the art. The art is misunderstood. And the art as an Islamic art is misunderstood, in particular through another contestation, which is very fashionable, is to say that Islamic art is not Islamic. And you have people talking Islamic art. And this is, to me, nonsense. This is not understanding what Islam is about and what Islamic art is about. Because Islamic art is Islamic. Even if you don't can put a finger on, oh, this is religion, it is about the faith. It is about it. This is an environment which is created to live by people who live the faith every day. Every single second they breathe. It's not about I'm going to the mass, on Sunday. I go out, I live my life, and then I return the next Sunday in the mass, and no, this doesn't work like, and in Islam you didn't have a French Revolution that said, okay, spirituality is something, reason is the supreme way of being. Reason is a supreme way of being, but not without God. Now this is the French Revolution told you something else, the Enlightenment told you something, but this is Western culture. This is not Islamic culture. I mean, I think people do not get what Islam is about. And also, they do not get that this is absolutely compatible with being modern, being part of this world or the previous century or the future century. You can be like that. You can be a full Muslim like an Umayyad today. It's a way of life. There are many ways of living life. And spirituality is not against modernity. And that's a prejudice. That's something that people are fighting. And in particular, in the contemporary world, with obviously the extremist violence, which is not, it's as if we would reduce Catholicism to the Inquisition. You cannot reduce Catholicism to the Inquisition, but we know how horrible, and we must not forget it's part of it, and it's part of the history of Catholicism. Like ISIS is part now, unfortunately, of the history of Islam, but it's not the faith. Like the Inquisition is the perfect counterexample. But you had that also. You had massacres of Buddhists in Chinese history of Buddhist erasure of Buddhist structures in some points, in some periods of history, of Chinese history and so on. You can find those things everywhere. So we have to get to our senses and then not stop. We have to stop to project our notion of modernity, our notion of faith, our notion of the role of faith in everyday life, in order to understand what is, any scholar, what is being Muslim. And this is the book of Shahab Ahmad is trying to explain this very well with flaws. I mean, it's a big book, so people are trying to pinpoint the flaws in this book, but the book is a big statement about that. And actually, roughly at the same time, I produced a little article that saying the same thing, basically in Iran, in an Iranian journal, in which I'm saying, well, look, I have no problem with things being Islamic in art. It's because they are. The question is to explain when you don't have an obviously religious object. How do you explain that? And then scholars, because they are trained in a certain way, they are trained to look at text and to get the right explanation. They are trained in literally connecting things. There is a writing here, there is a text, or the text explain the form. No, and when it doesn't work, they are at a loss of what to do. So it's secular, it's no longer, and they continue to use parameters of knowledge that do not work. The parameters of knowledge are there as tools, but then you cannot apply them literally all the time in the same way, depending on the cultural context. And for example, the divide between the secular and the religious doesn't work at all in the same way in the Islamic context, like in the Western context. I mean, and let's go back to understand what Islam is about, what Islamic metaphysics consists of, because Islamic art is the product of Islamic metaphysics.
I think that's a really inspiring and motivating way to end this discussion, which has been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure that many students and scholars of Islamic theology will not only rush to the library to read your book, but also rush to the mosques to go and to have a kind of, to recreate their experience and their agency in the face of these beautiful buildings. Dr. Gonzales, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your insight. And we very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it was a delight to share my own experience and my ideas about Islam and Islamic art. And my last message is that you cannot separate thinking about Islamic art from investigating Islamic theology, the two together. You can investigate Islamic theology per se without investigating Islamic art, but you cannot, that's the thing, it's unfair, but you cannot investigate Islamic art without looking into Islamic theology.
I think that will be the quote for our project, Dr. Gonzales. Yeah. Thank you so much.